Heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present, and fill us with all things, treasure of good gifts, and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us of all stain and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Welcome everybody here and everybody at home to our continued study in the book of Genesis. These last two lessons are going to cover the life of Joseph, if it's even possible to do it in 2 lessons. But we'll try. The life of Joseph occupies about a quarter of the whole book of Genesis. So it's a large section. It's like 10 to 12 chapters. And in a way, it synthesizes and brings to a climax the whole message of the patriarchs and of Genesis. And after Joseph, there's nothing for 400 years until Moses. So it's the end of sort of the patriarchal era. They climax in this man, this extraordinary man. And in the Orthodox Church, in the liturgical tradition, in the patristic tradition, Joseph looms very large. I want to begin tonight by reading to you one of my favorite hymns of all Holy Week. And it's the Kontakion and the Ekos of Holy Monday. So it's read after the 6th ode of Orthros on Holy Monday, which we will hear in church on Sunday, Palm Sunday evening. Okay? And this is it. And I hope that we'll appreciate this after these 2 lessons even more. Jacob lamented the loss of Joseph, but his righteous son was seated in a chariot and honored as a king. For he was not enslaved by the pleasures of Egypt, but was glorified by God, who sees the hearts of men and bestows upon them an incorruptible crown. Let us add our lamentations to the lamentations of Jacob, and let us weep with him for Joseph, his wise and glorious son, who was enslaved in body, but kept his soul free from bondage, and became Lord over all of Egypt. For God grants unto his servants an incorruptible crown. And then when we read the Synaxarion, it says, in Monday and Holy Week, the Holy Church commemorates, and we commemorate 2 things, but one of them is the wise and noble Joseph. The righteous Joseph showed himself to be a just ruler. Listen to this interesting phrase. Praise to thee, O giver of grain. Through the intercessions of the noble Joseph, O Christ our God, have mercy upon us. Now, there are a lot of allusions in the choice of these phrases to the spiritual life. And when we see Egypt, Egypt was an ancient empire and the source of all what we would call today the Western world's knowledge. According to Plato and Aristotle, math and philosophy all came from Egypt. And these things kind of filtered into the Greek tradition and through Alexander the Great to the rest of the world. So Egypt was already this powerhouse of technology and culture and religious and philosophical thought. Now, already in the time of Joseph. So for him to come from this backwater of nomads and become the Lord of Egypt, basically in control of all these things. And by the way, there are some people claim, and I tend to believe it, I haven't investigated it thoroughly, but some people claim to have found the granaries of Joseph. Of course, they're buried under, like, a football field deep of sand. This was a massive military fort to guard this grain. And you drove by in your cart after you went through, an inspection, and they literally dump the grain right in your cart and send you off. Okay, so Joseph is in charge of all this. So has this tradition in the scriptures and in the rabbinical writings of having incredible wisdom. Now, did he have a theophany? Did God appear directly to Joseph? The answer is no, but God appeared to him indirectly. And we'll see how the rabbinical tradition understood this. His father Jacob, what was Jacob's given name? His new name, Israel, which means? Or?
Contends with God, triumphs with God.
Or the one who sees God. Okay? So his father is the one who wrestled with God, who had these direct theophanies, who saw God face to face. All right, and this is his son. Scripture has a lot to say about how Jacob viewed him as his son. Okay, now, so spiritually, as a model of the spiritual life, Joseph is extraordinary. As far as the scriptural witness, history of God's action among his people, Joseph is the climax of all this before Moses. And then finally, I wanted to mention that in the early patristic tradition, Joseph once again plays a really key role. So let me explain how. When in the first, second, and third centuries, that is from the New Testament, the era of New Testament writings and the Apostolic Fathers, when the Christian message, the gospel, was being proclaimed, both to people who were of Hebrew background and people who were of Gentile, non-Hebrew background. The church had to kind of balance this war against those who accepted the Old Testament but did not accept the New. Okay? Those were Hebrews in arguing with Christians, sometimes arguing with Hebrew Christians. And Gnostics who rejected the Old Testament as an unworthy God, but accepted the New. How did the church respond to these two opposite poles? Well, it did so through a careful interpretation of the Old Testament to show that the New Testament was the fulfillment of the Old in the first place, through prophecy and other things, but also to show that it was the same God active in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as one scholar put it, Jesus was not God's afterthought. In other words, to defend belief in a Messiah who was crucified and rejected and then raised from the dead. How is it that this is not being openly prophesied? Okay? Because as we know from the New Testament, the conception and expectation of the Messiah was buried at the time of Christ. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Okay, so the way the fathers did this was through three ways of interpreting the Old Testament. One, they saw Jesus in proof texts or prophecies. Okay, Isaiah 7, the virgin shall conceive. And they disputed and debated those. The second way they saw it was through what's called typological exegesis, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And the third way was by seeing all of the Old Testament theophanies as theophanies specifically of the Son. So who was walking with Adam in the cool of the day? Who spoke to Moses out of the burning bush? Who wrestled with Jacob? Who told Joshua, remove your shoe because this ground is holy? Are you with us? Or who is the captain of the Lord's host? In all of these theophanies, the early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and others, they saw it as a manifestation of the Son, who was always with mankind, to whom judgment was committed from the beginning. Okay, like Jesus says in the Gospel of John, the Father has committed all judgment to the Son. Or, no man has seen God, but the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. Okay, these fathers, these early fathers, didn't understand these verses applying only to the incarnate Word, but to the pre-incarnate Word. He is the one who manifests the unknown God. He is the one to whom all judgment has committed. He is the one who is always with mankind. He is the God through whom God the Father created the world, and through whom God the Father redeemed the world. He is the prototype of us as we are in his image. Okay? Now, what is typological exegesis? Why is it important for our discussion tonight? It's different than allegorical exegesis. We have both in the New Testament. So Paul famously says in Galatians 4, he compares the son of Hagar, who's Ishmael, to the son of Sarah, who is Isaac. Isaac. Okay, and he says, you see, Isaac was the son of promise. Isaac was the miracle baby. In other words, Isaac represents the time of grace, the new covenant. Ishmael was when Sarah lost her faith a little bit and said, here, take my maidservant and father a child so you don't give your inheritance to your servant. Okay? So he represents, St. Paul says, the law, the old covenant. And then Paul says, now these things are an allegory. What does it say here in the New King James? I didn't write it down. Okay? Allegorumena. These things are allegorical. So allegory, however, is rather arbitrary. Very famously, the Song of Songs is in the Bible. Some people thought it shouldn't be in the Bible. It's just one big passionate love poem. What does that have to do with God? Okay, and certain fathers of the church, very famously Gregory of Nyssa or the last Bernard of Clairvaux, they said, no. All of this is an image to the soul and its relationship with God. And it's a pure love. And you're misunderstanding it. And it should stay in the Bible. And it stood in the Bible, okay? So, but sometimes, like in the Antiochian school, allegorical tradition, interpretation got a little bit unwieldy, and they just rejected it. So allegory took certain things, persons, whatever in the Bible, and compared them to spiritual truths or spiritual principles. So the point of allegory is to get away from the historical thing that we're discussing and discuss something else that is of a spiritual or intellectual nature. And that's exactly what Paul's doing. He's taking a historical story of the conflict between these two women and their two sons, and he's making an analogy, an allegory to something spiritual, and that is the reality of the two covenants. You guys follow me? Typological exegesis is different. Typological exegesis is grounded in the historical content of the text, and it is inextricable from it. And it takes a historical person or event in the Old Testament, and it shows an undeniable one-to-one correspondence with a person in the New. 90% of the time, Jesus, right? The other 10%, his mother. And all of this is in the New Testament too, but we can't get into it. All right, so typology, for example, the famous one that we sing of 2 periods of the year during Orthros is, of course, all the miracles of Moses with his staff are all seen as a prefiguration of the cross. Okay, and it's pretty undeniable, because when he goes up in Exodus 17 onto the mountaintop with the rod of God in his hand, and Moses is 100 years old, and he gets tired, so Aaron holds up, when he holds up the rod of God, Israel prevails. When he gets tired and puts down his hand, Amalek prevails. Okay, and he's doing this by God's command. So Aaron and Hur stand on both sides of him, and they put a rock for him to sit on. Okay, so who does he look like? Holding a staff, sitting on a rock. Okay, it's like somebody dying between two thieves, if you ask me. So that's an undeniable one-to-one correspondence image. And then God says, write this in a book. So through the cross, the powers of evil are overcome. All right, so this was a very powerful tool to integrate the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's done very consistently and universally within the first 100 years of the church. Okay? And if you read like Justin Martyr's dialogue of Trifo or Irenaeus of Leon, or I even put some quotations that I won't read in the interest of time from Melito of Sardis, okay, the first Christian Paschal sermon, where he says, if you want to see the Lord, scrutinize the typos, scrutinize the type. Why am I supposed to say it? Scrutinize the type. If you wish to see the mystery of the Lord, look at Abel, who was slain, Isaac, who was tied up, Joseph, who was traded, or betrayed, you would say, Moses, who was exposed, David, who was hunted down. Okay, so he sees an image of Christ in all these figures. All right, then we come to Joseph. Joseph is like the typos of all the TP. Okay, that's plural for typos, not typoses. Okay, the images and the parallels between Joseph and Christ are actually stunning. I counted 62 on my list, and you can Google it. Okay, let's just hit some key points. We all know his life, right? Both Joseph and Christ were beloved of their father, despised by brethren, accused of being dreamers, persecuted for telling the truth, betrayed and abandoned, stripped of their robes, sold for silver, right? Christ 30 pieces, Joseph, inflation. Okay, that's a bad joke for me. 20 for Joseph. I don't know why. Okay, Judah was the one who suggested selling his brother. Okay, Judas in Greek. His coat was sprinkled with the blood of a goat and given to his father. It depends on how much granularity we want to go into this. That's an atonement sacrifice, where the bull was wrapped on the door of the temple and sprinkled with the sacrificial blood of the goat. Tempted yet did not sin, falsely accused, gave no defense, unjustly condemned, numbered with transgressors, punished with 2 other criminals, one of whom was justified. 30 years old when he came out of prison, 30 years old when he began his ministry. That's very specific. Joseph was 17 when he went to prison, and he was 30 when he came out. Spent the best years of his life in a pit, in a grave. I mean, prison wasn't like now, CNN and 3 square meals. No, you're in the ground. You're not getting out. So, buried, imprisoned, had knowledge of the future, raised from the pit, or we might say raised from the dead, made king, given total authority, worshipped on the right hand of the throne, unrecognized by brethren, whom he subsequently forgave, became savior of many peoples, both Jew and Gentile, was given a wife from among the Gentiles. Okay? Basically was a single person in whom the redemption and salvation of God foresaw, and through his sufferings was made manifest to many. So Joseph, we could get into the granularity of all these things too, each event. Joseph is this like spectacular typos of Jesus Christ. And that's exactly how he was taken, not only by the early fathers of the church, but by in all our hymns, okay, especially on Holy Monday. So let's get into this story a little bit, as much as I can this evening. And we will not go through everything, but we will end today with him actually becoming king. So the first thing that we read in Genesis chapter 37 is that Jacob was dwelling in the land where his father was a stranger, that is in Canaan. And it says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Now, they were not his wives, but they're called his wives here, which tells us that not only Rachel, but Leah is probably dead. So they were his slaves, and they were his concubines, and now they're his wives. So this is well on in his years. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. He narked them out, or so it seems. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, so they hated him even more, and they said to him, he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? They understood the dream right away. Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father. And his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come and bow down to the earth before you, which is unusual because his mother's dead? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind, or we might say pondered it in his heart. Then the brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said, here I am. Please go and see if it's well with your brothers. Come back and bring me word. And he sent them to the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. And now a certain man found him wandering in the field. Let's skip this part. Okay. Now when they saw him far off, that is his brothers, even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said one to another, look, the dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us kill him now, and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him, and we shall see what shall become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Shed no blood. So they cast him into a pit which was in the wilderness. And do not lay a hand upon him. And Reuben said this to deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. Reuben is trying to rescue the boy. But it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colors. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And they sat down and had a meal. Time to celebrate. And they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill him and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our flesh. And his brothers listened. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and it's in italics. The brothers pulled Joseph up. The rabbinical tradition is the Midianites did. And lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. And then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. Oh, he found an empty tomb? Wondered what happened. And he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, where shall I go? And they took Joseph's tunic, and they killed a kid of the goats and dipped or even sprinkled the tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether this is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him, without doubt. Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned him many days, and said, I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. And his father wept for him. Now the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. Okay, what can we say about this? We read that Joseph is the son of Jacob in his old age. What is meant by this? Because Joseph had a younger brother, Benjamin, Wouldn't Benjamin be the son of Jacob's old age? There is a play on words here, and in the rabbinical tradition, it means that Joseph was the son of his father's wisdom. He was the son that was absorbing all the gifts of his father. And of course, you'll know from the story, Joseph is known for his almost supernatural wisdom. Well, it is supernatural wisdom. And so in the Hebrew text, there's a lot of poetry throughout the story in threes. And so here we read that his brothers hated him 3 times. First of all, because he snitched. Hebrew is, he brought his father an evil report. Not about all the brothers. About the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Okay, the 2 former slaves who are now considered wives. We don't know what they do, what he said or what they did. In the Hebrew tradition, they were stealing from their father and eating the goats. Okay, and they must have had some sort of inferiority complex. Okay, and so he went back and reported this to his father because that's what his father told him to do. Go see what they're doing and bring me word. So he came and he reported the truth. Okay, and they figured it out and they did not like him. That's number 1. They hated him for that. Number 2, they hated him, well, that was number 2. Number 1 is they hated him because he was their father's favorite. Number 2, because he snitched on him. And number 3, because of his dreams. And they knew that his dreams were true, and they interpreted them properly. What did this boy do? All he did was share his dreams with people whom he loved, and around whom he felt safe. Okay? It was not evident to him that his dream was not well received. Okay? Then he reported it because he kept coming back with more dreams. So however they said this, however it got into the text, they rebuked him for it, kind of. That's not how the boy took it. It was in his innocence, kind of his youthful innocence. I mean, if you had a young man who said, you know what, I'm gonna win the Super Bowl one day, or something like that, okay? And tells his brothers, I'm gonna be a Super Bowl champion. You see what I'm saying? You wouldn't necessarily go tell that to your friends, but you might tell it to your brothers. So Joseph had this intuition that God had called him to something great. God had called him to some sort of a rule. And he thinks that his brothers would be happy for him. Okay, so it can be dangerous to share our dreams, huh? It's the moral of the story. All right, now during this betrayal, this cold passage that they had dinner after throwing Joseph, their brother, stripping him. Can you imagine the kid has probably no shirt on, and they throw him in this pit that has no water. Okay, and he doesn't seem to, he resisted them, and he's not defending himself when he's sold into slavery. He's in shock. And they sit down and eat a meal, they don't even care. And who was the one who suggested this? Judah. Later on, we're going to see that Judah and all these guys, they had a conscience. So Judah, his atonement would come later when he allows and offers himself to be taken into custody so that Benjamin can go free. He's willing to pay the death penalty for Benjamin. Okay? But Joseph was silent. Now it's interesting that they deceived Jacob. You know, Jacob deceived his father. Okay, so it's kind of like Jacob. How many times did Jacob deceive his? He deceived his father for the blessing. Then there's another deception that he did. Jacob deceived Isaac, right? Told him, and then he deceived. I can't think right now.
He deceives Laban.
Yeah, and how did he do that? Okay, all right. But he was deceived by him as well, right? By the, okay, so, there's a kind of a charismatic gift that comes along with speaking the truth. Okay, you grow a sixth sense. Okay, now we come to this fascinating chapter. Am I going too slowly reading all this? Maybe. So, chapter 39, we find Joseph down in Egypt at this officer of Pharaoh's house, Potiphar, who hired him. And it says the Lord was with Joseph, and he became very successful. And he became the master of the house of his master, of Potiphar, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and saw that the Lord prospered everything. His master realizes this is a devout and talented kid. His God is with him. I'm appointing him over everything. Okay, so Joseph found favor in his sight, and he became overseer of his house, and he put all that he had in his hand. And it says in here someplace that I don't know where it is, here it is. And he did not know what he had, except for the bread he ate. Okay, so in other words, all Potiphar thought about was, what's for dinner? Don't worry, Joseph will take care of it. And then we're told in verse 6 of chapter 39 that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, or the Hebrew expression, he was fair to look upon, exactly as his mother Rachel was described. Now it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so it was that she spoke to Joseph day by day, and he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened that when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment and said, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was that when she saw that he had left his garment and fled, she called the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought in to us a Hebrew, talking about her husband, to mock us. And he came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when I lifted up my voice that he left his garment with me and fled. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home, then spoke to him words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought came in to me to mock me. And it happened that I lifted up my voice and cried, and his garment was left with me, and he fled. You think her wife? You think Potiphar believed his wife? I don't think so. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke that his anger was aroused. Maybe. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he was in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hands all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's hand, because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Okay, let's take a look at this for a minute. Joseph is athletic and good-looking. He's devout, intelligent. He's competent, and this woman is repeatedly tempting him, and in a not-so-subtle way. I like it. I'll share with you some of the social teaching. She didn't say, Joseph, I don't like perfume. Would you like to see my pottery collection in my room? Okay, she's saying, hey, let's get this on. No one's around. No one's going to ever know. Now, would Hollywood make a film of this? Okay, what would Hollywood do? Okay, no one will ever know. He would have remained a slave. his whole life. Okay? Instead, he chose to suffer for righteousness, suffer for his purity. Now, it's interesting that he makes this comment, how could I sin against God? Why would he see this as a sin against God? The law was not given yet. There's a little bit of flexibility in the law vis-a-vis his dad and previous generations in his household. So in the rabbinical tradition, he received the law from his father, who imparted to his son wisdom. And not only that, but the rabbis say that in the moment of his temptation, he saw the face of his father, who was the rock of Israel. Isn't that something interesting? That's almost Christological, isn't it? So he saw the face of his father, the rock of Israel. So Joseph suffers for righteousness, and he's going to pay a heavy price for this because he's going to be in jail for 13 years. Okay, but the whole story hinges on this. This was the moment of his righteous decision. And everything that comes subsequently now, all his sufferings in prison, which we'll go through, we might have to pause and think for a minute. Could Joseph still believe in his dreams now? Sold and betrayed by the brothers, falsely accused. He's going from bad to worse. His life is a complete disaster. You know, it is really amazing that in the ancient world, when you died, whether you were Greek or you were Hebrew, I don't care what your religious affiliation is, what they're called today is. When you died, you went to Sheol, okay, which was a place of darkness and silence. Now, it's described as dark and silent, meaning that you are in a state of consciousness without any ability that is mobile or intellectual, of communication. Okay? Except for this very kind of strange passage when Saul invokes the spirit of Eli. Was it Eli? Samuel. Okay. Which has various interpretations, whether it was indeed the soul of Samuel who appeared to him. Okay. We don't have anybody from the other world showing up on the scene. With that in mind, you have armies and soldiers and people fighting to the very death for a higher principle. Or, in this case, obeying the law no matter what. Purely out of love for God. Okay, so your hope in God, based on just the plain sense of the text, was only in this world. Now, of course, there are many things in the Psalms which show, you know, thou shalt not leave my soul in Hades, and other things like this. Okay? So, the whole idea now is that through this suffering for righteousness and this going into prison, God is going to prepare Joseph to be a passionless king. To be somebody that is utterly unswayed by any human opinion, offer, bribe, anything like that. Because he's going to wield a lot. You think that this would go right to his head. We'll get there. I'm going to talk for 50 minutes, and that means I have 20 more minutes. Keep me to it, please. Okay. All right, now, Genesis chapter 40, we find Joseph in prison. And it's quite an extraordinary passage, quite frankly. So, it came to pass that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in his custody. Then the butler and the baker and the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, dreamed a dream, both of them, each man a dream one night. And each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came to them in the morning and looked at them. This is one of my favorite verses in the whole story. And saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" It's a lot written between the lines there, isn't it? This kid's extraordinary. He's actually sensitive to how people feel. He's going to cheer them up. Why are you so sad? Well, duh, kiddo. I was in the palace. Now I'm in prison. And they said to him, "We each have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me." Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said, "Behold, in my dream there was a vine before me, and the vine were 3 branches, and though it budded, it blossomed, shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes." Notice all the triple stuff going on. Okay. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took, and I pressed, and I gave. That's just it, right? I'm skipping, but that's what he says. And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of the dream. 3 branches of 3 days, and with 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." Now, when you were his butler, you also took a little sip of that cup. Get my drift? And he's watching you. Did you turn green? Did you collapse? No? Okay, give me some of that wine. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Okay, be faithful to me. That's that, right? And make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this place. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and I also have done nothing that they should have put me into dungeon. I'm innocent. When the chief baker saw the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. And there were 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of your dream. 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh." Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. The only time birthday is mentioned in the Bible, by the way. Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker from among his servants, and he restored the butler. And he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hands, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Okay, so what can we say about this young man? He has stayed close to God. Not only does he have a fantastic attitude, and he's cheering people up, and he's a joy to be around, but he stayed close to God because he can interpret dreams. That's a spiritual gift which did not belong to everyone, right? That's the creme de la creme. That's like Daniel. So this chief baker, some have speculated that there was actually a plot to poison Pharaoh. Okay, and that these 2 men were thought to have belonged to this plot. Maybe the chief baker really was. Okay, but Joseph trusted God that he had a plan. And one of the things that I like to share with young people about this is that often they do the right thing. We do the right thing. And it doesn't turn out like we expected. Okay? And we actually suffer for doing the right thing. And then you have to even think, well, was it worth doing the right thing? How come all these other people who did not do the right thing are not seem to be suffering? Okay? So, but God had a plan for Joseph. We know the end. Joseph didn't know the end. And he's going to be left here for another 2 years. Can you think about this? You guys ever have to, remember in the old days when you used to wait for a letter in the mail? Anybody alive back in those old days? And you, I mean, like every single day you're opening your mail, it's not here. It's torture, right? This guy was waiting for 2 years. With patience, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he heard me. So the idea is that God had a plan. Joseph remained faithful in suffering. And all of these are all Christological themes. His patience was what God was using to prepare him to be a passionless and just ruler. Praise to thee, O giver of grain, the one who will preserve life and give that miraculous bread, that life-saving bread. Okay, so maybe we'll do one more little section here, and that'll be sufficient for tonight. We'll talk about his sudden change of destiny in Genesis chapter 41. So it came to pass after 2 full years that Pharaoh now has a dream, and he stood by a river, and he saw there came out of the river 7 cows looking fat, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking fat cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly the 7 heads of grain came up on a stalk, plump and good. And then behold, 7 thin heads, lighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. And Pharaoh awoke. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for the Magi of Egypt. And all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one that could interpret them for Pharaoh. And the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants. This guy is so smart. Isn't that smart? You know, I remember my faults and how right you were to throw me in the slammer. And by the way, when I was in the slammer, which I really deserved, O king, O Pharaoh, live forever, that there was a young Hebrew man, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him all our dreams, and he interpreted dreams for us. Each man interpreted according to his own dream, and it came to pass that as he interpreted, so it happened. Pharaoh said, go get him. So they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved and changed his clothing, and he came to Pharaoh. Actually, I think the Hebrew says they shaved him. It's like, dude, you need a shower. All done. I've been in prison for 13 years. Yeah. Put some of that cologne on here. Clean this boy up and bring him to the king. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamed a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it, but I heard that you understand dreams. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, here we go. Any guess what he's going to say? What'd you say?
I can't remember.
Okay.
God will be the
Amen, brother. It is not me. God gives interpretations of dreams. Okay? I give him all the glory. That's what he's saying up front. That's a tremendous confession of faith in this moment. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold in my dream. And he goes and he tells the dream. Okay, and then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Okay, there are going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And God has shown him what he's going to do. And then Joseph kind of changes vein, and he starts giving advice. Okay? He says there will be, the plenty will not be known because of the famine will be so severe. And the dream was repeated twice to Pharaoh because this is established by God, and God will now bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Now here's your advice. Set him over the land of Egypt. Let him appoint officers over the land and collect 1/5 of the produce of the land in 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food those good years that are coming and store it up under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities, that the food shall be a reserve for the 7 years of famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to him, can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you this, and there is no one as discerning or wise as you shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne shall anyone be greater than you. He's at the right hand of God. That's what he's saying. Because Pharaoh was God. See, I have set you over the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. Are you kidding me? You guys know what that means, right? They hit the signet. It's like full authority, credit card with unlimited withdrawal and no interest. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck and had him ride in the second chariot that he had and cried before him. They cried before him, bow the knee. And so he set him over all of Egypt. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man shall lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphet-Paneah. Okay. Then let's just end with this. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, we just have to pause and think for a minute. What in the world is going through this kid's head? So he's in a chariot. You have to kneel when he rides by. He began the morning, said his morning prayers, like he always did, in the pit. And he went to sleep that night, ruling Egypt. All of this is attributed to God. That is, if ever there was one, a resurrection from the dead. Perhaps the most important or the most astounding thing of the Joseph story is that he actually survived 13 years in this prison in those conditions. Not exactly running water. Okay? Disease, all those things, you don't really matter. Cut your finger, tough luck. Okay? Very inhuman conditions in the ancient world, in these prisons. And completely forgotten and with no advocate. And now he ends the day in absolute master of Egypt, wearing Pharaoh's own ring, in his own chariot, reporting to no one except Pharaoh himself. I mean, what are the chances? It's the probability of that happening. It's like Zippo. Okay, what's the probability of someone rising from the dead? You guys see where we're going with this? Okay, but his biggest challenges are ahead of him. Joseph's biggest challenges are yet to come. All right, I think that's good enough for tonight. Any questions, comments, observations, additions? Yes?
I also see in that story the fullness of justice coming, because when that all happened in the courtroom,